In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Medici, where marble whispers carried the weight of empires and the scent of betrayal lingered like perfume, there lived a truth that would reshape how men understood power itself. The year was 1503, and Florence trembled beneath the boots of foreign armies while its citizens clutched their prayers like drowning men clutch driftwood. It was in this crucible of chaos that the most profound lesson in human confidence would be forged, not through inspiration or hope, but through the cold mathematics of survival and the ruthless clarity that comes when all illusions are stripped away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard where servants hurried with downcast eyes, their movements quick and purposeful. They had learned, as all who survived in such times learned, that to be noticed was often to be destroyed. Yet in the tower study above, surrounded by maps of Italian city-states and correspondence from princes and generals, sat a man who had discovered something far more valuable than gold or armies: the secret architecture of absolute confidence. This was not the confidence of the naive or the blessed, not the hollow bravado of men who had never truly been tested. This was something altogether different, a confidence born from staring directly into the abyss of human nature and finding there not darkness, but clarity. It was the confidence of one who had learned to see the world as it truly was, stripped of the comfortable lies that most men wrapped around themselves like blankets against the cold wind of reality. The discovery had come gradually, through years of observation and brutal experience. In the courts of princes and the camps of mercenaries, in the chambers where treaties were signed with one hand while daggers were prepared with the other, a pattern had emerged. Those who possessed true power, not the temporary authority of office or title, but the deep, unshakable power that commanded respect and fear in equal measure, all shared certain characteristics. They had learned to operate by principles that would horrify the common man, yet these principles had made them masters of their fate in ways that conventional morality never could. The first principle was perhaps the most disturbing to those raised on gentle philosophies: the complete abandonment of the need to be loved. In the merchant quarters of Florence, where traders haggled over silk and spices, men spent their days seeking approval, crafting their words to please their customers, their families, their neighbors. They lived in constant anxiety about what others thought, adjusting their behavior like weather vanes spinning in the wind of public opinion. But those who wielded real power had discovered that this need for love was not merely unnecessary. It was actively destructive to true confidence. The realization came with the force of revelation. When you no longer needed others to validate your worth, when you no longer sought their approval or feared their disapproval, you became fundamentally immune to their attempts to manipulate you. The merchant who desperately needed his customers to like him could be controlled through their moods and whims. The prince who needed his subjects' love could be paralyzed by the threat of their displeasure. But the one who had liberated himself from this need moved through the world like a force of nature, unchanging, unmoved by the storms of other people's emotions. This was not cruelty for its own sake, though it might appear so to those who observed it from the outside. It was simply the recognition that human nature operated by laws as fixed and predictable as those governing the movement of planets. Men respected strength and despised weakness, regardless of their public proclamations to the contrary. They followed those who projected certainty and abandoned those who showed doubt, no matter how virtuous the doubter might be. These were not moral judgments but observable facts, as reliable as the sunrise. The second principle followed naturally from the first: the strategic use of fear as a tool of influence. In the churches of Florence, priests preached that love was the highest virtue, that men should seek to inspire affection rather than dread. But those who studied power with the detachment of natural philosophers had observed something quite different in practice. Love was fickle, changing with circumstances and mood. Fear, however, was constant. A man might stop loving you if you disappointed him, or if someone more charming appeared, but he would continue to fear you as long as you maintained the capacity to harm him. This did not mean ruling through terror or violence, though these tools had their place in the arsenal of power. Rather, it meant cultivating an aura of unpredictability and strength that made others hesitant to oppose you. It meant being known as someone whose boundaries, once crossed, brought swift and certain consequences. In the diplomatic corps, there were ambassadors who were beloved by all but whose words carried no weight, and there were others who were feared but whose slightest suggestion could redirect the policies of kingdoms. The difference lay not in their virtue, but in their reputation for following through on their promises, both pleasant and unpleasant. The cultivation of such reputation required a particular kind of discipline. It meant never making threats you were not prepared to carry out, never promising rewards you could not deliver. It meant being absolutely reliable in both your punishments and your benefits. Most men, seeking to be liked, would make grand promises they could not keep and issue warnings they dared not enforce. This destroyed their credibility and left them powerless despite whatever official authority they might hold. But those who had mastered the art of power spoke less and delivered more, creating around themselves an atmosphere of certainty that made others naturally defer to their will. The third principle was perhaps the most sophisticated, the deliberate cultivation of mystery and unpredictability. In the marketplaces of Florence, there were merchants whose every move could be anticipated, whose reactions to any situation were known in advance. These men, however honest or skilled they might be, found themselves at the mercy of their competitors who could predict and counter their every strategy. But there were others who seemed to operate by no discernible pattern, whose responses to situations varied in ways that kept their rivals constantly off balance. This unpredictability was not random chaos but carefully calculated complexity. It meant sometimes being generous when cruelty was expected, sometimes being harsh when mercy was anticipated. It meant revealing different aspects of your character to different people, so that none could claim to know you completely. Like a master chess player who could execute multiple strategies simultaneously, the truly powerful kept their opponents guessing about their next move. This principle extended to the management of one's own emotions and reactions. The common man wore his heart on his sleeve, allowing others to read his moods and manipulate them accordingly. His anger could be provoked, his sympathy exploited, his fears triggered by those who understood his patterns. But those who had achieved true confidence had learned to govern their emotional expressions as carefully as a general manages his troops. They revealed only what served their purposes, keeping their true thoughts and feelings as protected as state secrets. The cultivation of this emotional sovereignty required daily practice, like a musician practicing scales. It meant learning to pause between stimulus and response, to choose your reactions rather than simply experiencing them. When insulted, instead of immediately responding in kind, you would consider what response would best serve your long-term interests. When praised, instead of basking in the approval, you would analyze what the praiser hoped to gain from their flattery. Every interaction became an opportunity to strengthen your emotional discipline and expand your options for response. As these principles took root in daily practice, they produced a transformation that was visible to all who encountered it. Where once there had been a person subject to the whims of fortune and the opinions of others, there now stood someone who seemed to operate by different laws entirely. Insults that would have stung before now bounced off harmlessly. Setbacks that would have caused despair now became simply new data to be incorporated into future planning. The approval or disapproval of others, which had once held such power over behavior, now registered as mere weather, noted but not determinative. This transformation was not without its costs. Old friendships, based on mutual need and emotional dependency, often withered away. Family members, accustomed to being able to influence through guilt or manipulation, found their old methods ineffective and sometimes responded with bewilderment or hostility. Society itself seemed to resist the presence of someone who refused to play by its established rules of emotional exchange. But these costs were more than offset by the gains. In negotiations, whether for business or personal matters, the newly transformed individual found themselves at an enormous advantage. Others, still governed by their emotional needs and social anxieties, revealed their weaknesses and desires clearly. They could be led to make decisions that served the confident person's interests simply by appealing to their various fears and cravings for approval. More importantly, the internal experience of life changed dramatically. Where once there had been constant anxiety about what others thought, there was now a deep calm. Where once there had been anger and frustration when things did not go according to plan, there was now a philosophical acceptance combined with strategic thinking about how to turn circumstances to advantage. The emotional energy that had once been dissipated in worry and people-pleasing was now available for focused pursuit of genuine goals. The political arena, these principles manifested in ways that would have seemed miraculous to those who knew only conventional approaches to influence. A senator who had mastered these arts could walk into a room full of rivals, and without raising his voice or making threats, shift the entire dynamic through nothing more than his presence and carefully chosen words. His colleagues, still operating by the old rules of argument and persuasion, found themselves somehow agreeing to proposals they had intended to oppose. The mechanism was not mysterious, though it appeared so to those who experienced it. By refusing to show need or desperation, by maintaining an air of having acceptable alternatives to any proposed deal, by demonstrating through small actions that cooperation was rewarded while opposition brought consequences, such a person created an environment where others naturally gravitated toward agreement. They made cooperation seem attractive and resistance seem costly, all without appearing to exert any pressure at all. In personal relationships, the application of these principles created dynamics that conventional wisdom would have considered impossible. Rather than pursuing others who seemed uninterested, the confident individual would withdraw, making themselves scarce and valuable. Rather than trying to win arguments through logic or emotion, they would simply state their position once and then refuse to engage in debate, letting others exhaust themselves against their unmoving certainty. This approach often produced results that years of conventional effort had failed to achieve. People who had been indifferent or even hostile found themselves drawn to someone who seemed to need nothing from them. Partners who had grown bored with predictable behavior became intrigued by someone whose reactions could no longer be taken for granted. The very refusal to chase made others want to be caught. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in the relationship with failure and setback. The unconverted mind experienced defeat as a reflection of personal worth, leading to shame, self-doubt, and paralysis. Every setback became evidence of inadequacy, every criticism a wound to the ego. But those who had internalized these principles experienced failure differently, not as judgment but as information, not as permanent defeat but as temporary tactical setback. This shift in perspective was perhaps more valuable than all the social advantages combined. It meant that risks could be taken without the paralyzing fear of judgment that kept most people trapped in mediocrity. New ventures could be attempted, bold moves executed, controversial positions taken, all without the emotional devastation that would normally follow if things went wrong. Failure became simply another form of education, and often a more valuable one than success. The confidence that emerged from this transformation was qualitatively different from what most people understood by the term. It was not the brittle confidence of those who had never been tested, which shattered at the first sign of opposition. Nor was it the false confidence of those who inflated themselves through self-deception and positive thinking. It was the confidence of someone who had looked squarely at the worst possibilities and found themselves still standing. This type of confidence was unshakable because it was based not on favorable circumstances or the approval of others, but on proven capacity to navigate whatever reality might present. It was the confidence of a ship's captain who had weathered every type of storm and knew that while he might not be able to control the weather, he could always control his response to it. Such confidence inspired others not through warmth or charisma, but through the deeper appeal of strength and reliability. The daily practice of these principles required constant vigilance and self-correction. Old habits of seeking approval, avoiding conflict, and revealing too much of one's inner state would reassert themselves unless actively countered. Like a garden that reverts to wilderness without tending, the mind would drift back toward conventional patterns unless regularly cultivated with conscious practice. This cultivation involved daily exercises in emotional discipline. When faced with criticism, the practitioner would pause and consider whether the criticism served any useful purpose before deciding whether to feel affected by it. When offered praise, they would analyze the motives behind it before deciding how much weight to give it. Every social interaction became an opportunity to practice maintaining inner independence while appearing normally engaged. The exercises extended to the deliberate exposure to uncomfortable situations. Just as physical fitness requires progressively challenging workouts, emotional strength required progressively challenging social situations. This meant sometimes taking positions that would be unpopular, sometimes refusing requests that would normally be granted out of desire for approval, sometimes allowing others to be disappointed or even angry rather than sacrificing one's own interests to maintain artificial harmony. Over time, these exercises built a kind of social muscle memory. Responses that once required conscious effort became automatic. The pause between provocation and response became so ingrained that it happened without conscious thought. The analysis of others' motives and the strategic choice of one's own response became as natural as breathing. The transformation was often noticed by others before it was fully felt by the practitioner themselves. Old acquaintances would comment that something had changed, though they could rarely identify exactly what. Some would be attracted to the new energy and self-possession, while others would feel vaguely uncomfortable around someone who no longer responded to their usual methods of influence. Both reactions were valuable data about the success of the transformation. As the principles became more deeply integrated, they began to generate their own momentum. Success in applying them led to increased confidence in their effectiveness, which led to more bold application, which led to greater success. A virtuous cycle emerged where each victory, no matter how small, reinforced the practitioner's willingness to operate by these new rules rather than reverting to old patterns. The most profound realization that emerged from sustained practice was that most of what people called confidence was actually just the absence of fear and need. Remove the fear of disapproval and natural leadership emerged. Remove the need for others' validation, and authentic self-expression became possible. Remove the anxiety about outcomes, and strategic thinking became clearer. The confident person was not someone who had added something extra to their personality, but someone who had subtracted the weights that kept everyone else underwater. This understanding led to a different relationship with other people's behavior and emotions. When someone became angry, instead of feeling responsible for managing their emotion or taking it personally, the practitioner would simply observe it as information about that person's internal state. When someone tried to manipulate through guilt or flattery, instead of being affected by it, they would note the attempted technique and consider what it revealed about the manipulator's assessment of their vulnerabilities. This detached observation of human behavior patterns proved endlessly fascinating and useful. People revealed themselves constantly through their choice of persuasion techniques, their emotional reactions, and their assumptions about what would motivate others. Those who had learned to watch without being emotionally involved gained access to information that was invisible to those who were still caught up in the drama of social interaction. The strategic advantages that flowed from this emotional detachment were immense. In business negotiations, the ability to remain unmoved by pressure tactics while accurately reading the emotional state of opponents led to consistently favorable outcomes. In personal relationships, the combination of unavailability and genuine indifference to manipulation created a magnetic effect that drew others in while keeping them at optimal distance for maintaining interest and respect. But perhaps the greatest advantage was the simple peace that came from no longer being at the mercy of external circumstances and other people's moods. The person who had achieved this state could walk through the world like someone with diplomatic immunity, present and engaged, but fundamentally untouchable by the chaos that consumed others. They could observe the comedy of human desperation and manipulation with the same detached interest that a scientist might observe the behavior of laboratory subjects. This detachment was not coldness or cruelty, though it might appear so to those accustomed to emotional enmeshment. It was simply clarity, the ability to see what was actually happening rather than what one wished or feared was happening. This clarity enabled more effective compassion, not less, because help could be offered based on what would actually benefit the other person rather than what would make the helper feel good about themselves. The journey from conventional emotional dependency to this state of sovereign confidence was not without its dark moments. There were periods of isolation as old relationships fell away and new ones had not yet formed. There were times of doubt when the old ways seemed easier, even if they were ultimately less effective. The transition period required faith in principles whose benefits had not yet been fully experienced. But for those who persevered through this transition, what emerged was something that could only be called freedom, not the political freedom of being able to vote or speak, but the deeper freedom of being genuinely independent in mind and spirit. This freedom manifested in every aspect of life, from the smallest social interactions to the largest life decisions. It was the freedom to act based on one's own assessment of what was right and beneficial, rather than on the opinions and expectations of others. This freedom brought with it a responsibility that many were not prepared to accept. When you could no longer blame your circumstances on other people's behavior or society's expectations, when you could no longer take comfort in being a victim of forces beyond your control, you became fully responsible for your own outcomes. This responsibility was terrifying to some and liberating to others, but it was inescapable for those who had achieved genuine confidence. The practical applications of these principles extended into every area of human endeavor. In leadership positions, The person who needed nothing from their subordinates except competent performance found themselves able to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by concern for popularity. They could promote based on merit rather than personal loyalty, discipline based on performance rather than emotional reaction, and inspire through strength rather than charisma. In creative endeavors, the freedom from need for approval allowed for authentic expression rather than crowd-pleasing. The artist or writer who truly did not care whether their work was praised or criticized could create from a place of genuine inspiration rather than calculated effect. Paradoxically, this independence often produced work that was more moving and influential than deliberate attempts to please audiences. In intellectual pursuits, the ability to examine ideas without emotional investment in their truth or falsity led to clearer thinking and more accurate conclusions. The researcher who genuinely did not care whether their hypothesis was confirmed or disproven could design better experiments and interpret results more accurately. The philosopher who felt no need to defend their previous positions could evolve their thinking based on new evidence. As these principles spread their influence through all areas of life, they created a compounding effect. Success in one area provided evidence for the effectiveness of the approach, encouraging more complete application in other areas. The person who found that emotional independence improved their business results became more willing to apply the same principles in their personal relationships. The one who discovered that strategic unpredictability enhanced their romantic appeal became more willing to apply it in their professional negotiations. Over years of practice, what had once required conscious effort became unconscious competence. The practitioner no longer had to remind themselves to pause before responding to provocation. The pause became automatic. They no longer had to deliberately choose their emotional reactions. The choosing became natural. The principles that had once seemed foreign and difficult became as integrated as walking or breathing. At this stage, the transformation was complete not because there was nothing left to learn, but because the fundamental orientation toward life had permanently shifted. Instead of asking, "What do others want from me?" the practitioner automatically asked, "What do I want from this situation?" Instead of, "How can I avoid disapproval?" they asked, "What outcome would best serve my interests?" Instead of, "What will people think?" they asked, "What will produce the results I seek?" This shift in internal questions led to entirely different behaviors and, consequently, entirely different results. The person who asked different questions got different answers, made different choices, and therefore lived in a fundamentally different reality than those who remained trapped in conventional patterns of thinking and feeling. They inhabited the same physical world as everyone else, but operated by different rules, and therefore achieved different outcomes. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how it appeared to others who had not it themselves. They saw someone who seemed to have supernatural powers of influence and persuasion, who could navigate complex social and political situations with ease, who seemed immune to the stresses and anxieties that plagued normal people. But there was nothing supernatural about it. It was simply the result of applying natural laws of human behavior with consistency and intelligence. The principles themselves were not secret knowledge hidden away in ancient texts or exclusive schools. They were observable by anyone willing to study human nature with sufficient detachment and honesty. The challenge was not in understanding them intellectually, but in developing the discipline to apply them consistently, especially when doing so required giving up the comfortable illusions and emotional habits that most people clung to as security blankets. Those who had successfully made the transition often found themselves in the position of teachers, though rarely in formal academic settings. Their very presence served as an education for others who were ready to learn. People would study their behavior, trying to understand how they achieved such consistent results in situations where others failed. Some would ask directly for guidance, while others would attempt to copy their techniques without understanding the underlying principles. The teaching of these principles required careful judgment about the readiness of the student. Those who sought the benefits without accepting the responsibility often misapplied the techniques, using them for petty manipulation rather than genuine personal development. They wanted the power without the discipline, the results without the transformation. Such partial application often backfired, creating the appearance of calculating coldness without the underlying strength that made the approach effective. But for those who were ready to undertake the complete transformation, who were willing to give up their emotional dependencies and accept full responsibility for their outcomes, the principles provided a reliable path to a kind of power and freedom that few ever experienced. It was not the power to control others, which was always temporary and ultimately illusory, but the power to control oneself, which was permanent and real. This self-control was not repression or denial of natural impulses, but their conscious direction toward strategic ends. The confident person still felt anger, desire, fear, and other emotions, but they felt them as information rather than commands. They could experience the emotion, analyze what it told them about the situation, and then choose their response based on what would best serve their long-term interests rather than what would provide immediate emotional relief. The mastery that resulted from years of such practice was apparent to everyone who encountered it, though few could articulate exactly what they were observing. They saw someone who seemed to move through life with a different quality of energy, more focused, more purposeful, less affected by the daily dramas that consumed others. They saw someone who could remain calm in crisis, confident in uncertainty, and uncommitted to any particular outcome while still working effectively toward their goals. This quality of being in the world but not of it, engaged but not attached, powerful but not dependent on power, represented the ultimate achievement of these principles. It was a way of living that maximized both effectiveness and peace, both influence and freedom. It was what human beings could become when they shed their illusions about how the world worked and learned to operate according to its actual laws rather than their preferred fantasies about how they wished it worked. The legacy of those who achieved such mastery extended far beyond their personal success. They served as proof that human nature was not fixed, that the patterns of behavior that trapped most people in mediocrity and unhappiness were not inevitable. They demonstrated through their example that another way of being was possible, more effective, more peaceful, and ultimately more satisfying than the conventional approach to life that most people accepted as natural and unchangeable. In the end, the forge that created such unbreakable confidence was not made of fire and metal, but of principles applied with unwavering consistency over time. It was a forge that each person had to build for themselves, using the raw materials of daily experience and the tools of honest self-observation and disciplined practice. The heat that transformed ordinary human consciousness into something approaching sovereignty came not from external circumstances, but from the friction between old habits and new choices, between comfortable illusions and uncomfortable truths. Those who emerged from this forge carried with them not just personal power, but a deeper understanding of human nature itself. They had learned through direct experience how the invisible forces of emotion, social pressure, and psychological need shaped behavior and outcomes. This knowledge made them not only more effective in achieving their own goals, but more compassionate toward others who remained trapped in patterns they themselves had once struggled to escape. The confidence that emerged from this process was truly psychopathic in its level, not because it was cruel or antisocial, but because it was unshakable by the social and emotional pressures that controlled everyone else. It was confidence forged in the crucible of reality rather than fantasy, tested against the full spectrum of human behavior rather than only its pleasant aspects, and tempered by the discipline of consistent principle rather than the weakness of emotional reaction. Such confidence, once achieved, became a permanent alteration in the architecture of consciousness itself. It could not be lost through temporary setbacks or taken away by others' disapproval. It was based not on favorable circumstances, but on proven capacity to handle unfavorable ones. It was not dependent on success, but on the inner certainty that whatever happened, it could be navigated with intelligence and composure. This was the true gift that these ancient principles offered to those bold enough to embrace them fully. Not just power over others, but power over oneself. Not just the ability to influence circumstances, but the ability to remain unperturbed when circumstances could not be influenced. Not just success in the conventional sense, but freedom in the deepest possible meaning of that word. It was confidence not as emotion, but as fact. The simple, unshakable knowledge that whatever life might present, one possessed the tools to handle it with grace and effectiveness. Is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.